kept the first half of the presentation pretty high level, just about what the plan is and how we got to where we are. Not included a lot of the fine details of what's in the plan. If we have time, I have some examples we can give, but talking about all the proposals and the plan would be an hour or two presentation just in itself. So first part will just be a few slides on kind of the history of planning in the area and how we got to where we are. Down, so I have to change mine and the screen because we're on two different computers. So just for context, Fisheries Management Zone 15 is what's highlighted there in white. So it's a fairly big zone in the province, extends from Georgian Bay to the Ottawa River, not including those two water bodies. Algonquin Park is part of the zone, but it's not part of this fisheries management plan. It was specifically excluded, and they're currently starting to do their own planning process for the park. So Muskoka Watershed, I looked it up. There's a background report that has a lot of the kind of descriptive information on the zone. I think it's about 20% of the fisheries management zone is the Muskoka Watershed. So a little bit of history. There has been previous planning exercises for fisheries management in the area. Back in the late 80s, there was things called the district fisheries management plans. Each district produced one. They were very focused on individual lake management. So the Bracebridge area had one, Minden, Parry Sound. And they all had kind of common themes that we still have today as major concerns: fishing pressure, introduced species, habitat alteration, and so on. Those plans, nominally expired around the year 2000. There wasn't immediately anything in place to replace them. So kind of in the meantime, a couple of more regional plan exercises came along, which are still more or less in place. The management plan for naturally reproducing brook trout and lake trout in South Central Ontario came into place in the 1990s, and that's really what's dictating what most of the regulations are on those species right now. So seasons and size limits. And then there was a walleye regulation review in the kind of mid 2000s. So the kind of vacuum in higher level planning started to be filled around that same time. There was a new provincial document released, the Ecological Framework for Fisheries Management, which the main gist of it was a shift from that individual lake kind of management that was in the earlier plans to a landscape level of management. That didn't go down. The fishing divisions we had at the time were changed to fisheries management zones. Some of the boundaries were amended to follow more ecological or socioeconomic boundaries that were more logical units of management rather than just squares on the map that they were before. Marked the beginning of the provincial broad scale monitoring program, which is a province-wide program that monitors the state of fisheries, fish populations, and the stresses on them at a provincial level. So within each fisheries management zone, there's a program of monitoring lakes on an ongoing basis to provide us information to input into these planning processes. And then finally, the part of the new framework was initiation of a new planning process, these fisheries management zone plans, which entailed the use of advisory councils to provide input to them. The first of them were approved in 2019, and individual other zones have been starting their plans kind of after that. Subsequent to that, there was a provincial fish strategy, which provided high-level direction to these plans. So within Zone 15, the planning process involves the formation of a steering committee, which is managers from each of the main M&R districts and the regional office that have land within the zone. So Bancroft, Pembroke, Parry Sound, and a regional office. And the planning team made up of biologists from those different units, and the Public Advisory Council. So we started meeting with the council in in March 2017. It's kind of a diverse group whose role is to provide advice, recommendations to us on how we will manage the fisheries going forward. So today we've had 34, I think actually 35 meetings now, but over those 5 or 6 years, but kind of monthly meetings, fairly intensive. Cycle of providing information to the council to get them educated on the status of things and processes of establishing objectives and so on for the different parts of the plan. So a draft plan was posted on the environmental registry last fall, and there's a background information report that goes along with that. We received about 500 comments on it, which is by far the largest number that's been received on a plan to date, and the process of going through those comments, making revisions to plan, briefing, doing briefings to managers and so on is ongoing. So we're hoping still to get approval of it this year, but it wouldn't be until next year at the earliest that the major parts would be implemented, that being the fishing regulations. One more. I'm not sure I didn't go. Oh, that one too. So the background report, it's on that environmental registry. You can look at it if you wish. It's a ponderous document. There's a huge amount of kind of background descriptive data about the zone, things like how many watersheds there are and what proportion of the land bases in the different watersheds, which fish species occur, things like that. The bulk of it, though, is that status of a featured sport fish species, so the main species in the zone, information on their distribution, their abundance, fishing pressure on them, all that kind of thing. So there's lots of data that's been derived from that broad scale monitoring program. And those figures are presented in that report. Information on the fishery itself and how we're currently managing them. So the plan is part, so that figure on the right is lifted from that provincial fish strategy. So the plan itself is part of a adaptive management cycle. It has a higher level regulatory policy framework. So the plan itself, has the objectives, benchmarks, targets, things like that. Through the implementation, we take actions to try to reach those, and through the broad scale monitoring program, we monitor whether those are being reached, which will feed back into review and updated plan through time. So it provides a long-term direction. Long-term, I think the target review period is about 10 years, but so some of the targets are in the 20+ year time horizon. Includes things like fish community objectives, and then for those featured species, goals, objectives, actions, so on for the major management tools that we have, which are regulations, fish stocking, stewardship activities like education and so on. And there's chapters on invasive species, climate change, and monitoring. So the top is being cut off there, but it says key considerations and challenges for planning. Focus in the plan is on conserving our natural brook trout and lake trout populations, which are the main native fish species in large parts of the zone. Within the southern region, southern Ontario, most of the remaining natural trout waters are in zone 15, and they're being challenged by a variety of stresses, fishing pressure, introduced species, competing species, climate change, other changes, landscape level changes to the aquatic environment. So all those things tend to act negatively on those species. They only tend to get worse through time. So that is the focus of the plan, on preserving what we can of those native species. And as I mentioned earlier, Concrete Park is not part of this plan. It's my time. Good. Okay. I'm just getting into some of the specifics of the plan content right now. So this is kind of a key figure from the plan that establishes the high level fish community objectives. So it's broken down by thermal preferences, which aligns fairly well with our native and introduced species within the zone. So our native cold water fish species are brook trout, lake trout, and lake whitefish. Cool water species, the walleye, pike, and muskellunge, they're largely all introduced populations in the zone. There's some native populations in the lower elevations, like the fringe along Georgian Bay and the Ottawa Valley, but most populations are introduced. And then warm water species are bass, crappie, and panfish. And again, many of the bass, pretty well all the crappie populations are all introduced. Some cool water species are kind of well established across the zone, and bass are as well. Crappie are kind of a newcomer and are spreading fairly quickly. So as cold water populations are being given priority to conserve the populations, that is retaining their presence on the landscape over time because of those threats we have, and given priority to over the other thermal regimes, where this is more on just maintaining populations, and where it's, I say it's maintaining, it means maintaining the distribution, not increasing their range over what it is currently, and improving the quality, because those are species that are generally highly sought by fishermen, especially walleye. And the warm water species, because they tend to be highly resilient and have negative impacts on the other ones, to manage them more liberally by increasing opportunities for fishing for them, and again restricting their spread across the landscape where we can. So that really guided the individual species goals and objectives through the planning process. So for each of the main species, went through a process with the advisory council of reviewing the background information and what their distribution is, the population status, identifying what the issues are and opportunities are for managing them, and through a kind of an iterative process of awarding objectives, goals and objectives of what we want to achieve with those, with each species. And then once we had those kind of settled down, we decided on the actions, which are primarily those regulation and stocking strategies. So I'm still good for time. Yeah, I don't know how much I had. So I'll get into, so there's not time to go through every individual species in detail, what's in the plan. So I just put in the brook trout, lake trout, and whitefish objectives and some of the main changes. But if you have questions about some other species or changes, we can get into those if you wish. It would just take too much time to go through them all. So for brook trout, to mention, it's one of the main native species in the zone, fairly well distributed in the central highlands area, pretty well absent naturally from the lower elevation areas. So I think there was about 200 identified native populations. The biggest threat to them is the introduction of non-native species. They're very poor competitors with especially other large bodied predators like bass, pike, so on. So this shows the status of those in that regard. So the solid red dots are lakes that have been identified to have natural brook trout populations, but they have been impacted by, or they have the presence of at least deleterious species, so those bass, pike, and so on, that really affect their abundance. When those species are present, those populations just tend to be present either at a remnant or very low level, just kind of persisting across the landscape. Then the open red circles are populations where no deleterious species have been detected yet. And you can see there tend to be clustered just around that edge of Algonquin Park. And those lakes tend to be small and fairly remote. That makes them fairly immune to intentional or accidental introductions of non-native species. So most of the big lakes are good native brook trout populations are essentially gone, or just really dealing with a remnant resource at this point. So our goal, consistent with those fish community objectives, is to conserve the populations by maintaining or increasing the number of lakes where those populations actually exist. Managing them so we have high quality populations, as people will value them as fishing opportunities and hopefully want to protect them, avoid those introductions of non-native species. And the fishery primarily provided by our fish stocking. Probably 90% plus of the brook trout fishery is dependent on our hatchery stocking. So the primary action there is implementing a more conservative fishing regulation that we currently have on our natural brook trout waters. Currently, you can generally fish 9 months of the year with no restrictions on size and a fairly liberal catch limit in most lakes. There's a few exceptions, but the proposal is to shorten that season considerably, so there wouldn't be a winter fishery for brook trout anymore and a reduced catch limit. Again, the intent of that is to keep populations healthy so that the open water fishery will be a better quality, and perhaps people will be less likely to introduce other species into them. A subset of all our natural brook trout lakes is what we're calling prime natural brook trout lakes. And they would have that same shorter seasonal or catch limit, but they would also have a restriction on the use of live bait fish, again, to try to reduce the possibility of introducing non-native species. And in the plan, we're not sure yet if we'll, how it will be implemented, but we're also proposing that at least in some lakes, we're going to try a regulation where only brook trout fishing would be allowed. So fishing for other species wouldn't be permitted, and to try to be a disincentive to people introducing other species. If you can't fish for them, why would you put them there? And then for each species, we have a stocking strategy. So for brook trout, for our natural populations, the stocking strategy is essentially to not stock them. So supplemental stocking, which is stocking where a population is already present, wouldn't occur because of the known or potential impacts of stocking, like genetic inbreeding, attracting additional fishing pressure, and so on. Stocking is generally not compatible with natural populations, so that won't occur. It generally doesn't happen now. It's been discontinued over the years, but hasn't really been formally put into a planning document before. We'll do some stocking for rehabilitation or reintroduction purposes, where we can identify opportunities for that, and again continue to stock brook trout on a put rotate basis, primarily to provide the fishery. So the stocking strategy for our stock fisheries is to keep stocking them, to divert pressure from those natural lakes, and just to create those recreational economic opportunities to fish for them. And for those, the season will be open year round. It says already existing, but that's not the case across the zone. In some parts of the zone, you can fish stock lakes year round, but not everywhere. But that will standardize it year round. That higher catch limit will be applied to all the stock lakes as well. I'm kind of going pretty fast here. Are there any questions that go from species to species or section to section?
Just strictly brook trout, lake trout, often found in the same lakes?
Can be. Outside of Algonquin Park tend not to be, just because of the lakes, because they're the fish community of those lakes now. within the park, certainly there are a lot of lakes that have both of them. And probably historically, a lot of our lakes had both of them as well, but and where they, I guess they still do occur, but when I can say no, they're not occurring as healthy populations. So like Lake of Bays, for example, there are a few brook trout there as a remnant resource, but it's very, very limited. So, yeah, not really healthy populations. So moving on to lake trout, we call it kind of a keystone species in the zone. Well, brook trout are certainly important and present on a lot of lakes. They don't have nearly the size of the fishery or the widespread distribution that lake trout have. So this map shows the distribution of lakes in the zone. There's, I think, 174 designated natural lake trout lakes. There is a formal list of what is a lake trout lake. So the list is broken down by natural lakes and stocked lakes. Foot rotate is that PGT. So, and the distribution tends to be clustered closer to Algonquin Park and the Highlands area, but there are some outliers, quite a cluster around Perry Sound area, south Halliburton County area. So most of the lakes tend to be in that Halliburton County, Bancroft area, but they tend to be mostly smaller lakes. Most of the bigger lakes are in Muskoka, of course, the three big lakes, Lake of Bays, Quagama. Even though it's only 5 lakes, they do represent a fairly sizable portion of the overall resource when you think of it in terms of surface area or the number of fish in those lakes. So yeah, about 170 something natural lakes and those 70 lakes that are currently stocked on a per rotate basis.
Steve, can you just clarify the PGT, the green versus the red?
Yeah, so PGT are the stocked lakes. And the red are the natural lakes. So for brook trout, most lakes that are stocked probably never had native brook trout populations just because they have natural habitat limitations. But for lake trout, most of those lakes probably did have natural populations, but they're not currently sustaining them. Combination of habitat amount, habitat quality, and again, introduction of non-native species impacted.
What is the difference between not stocking natural brook trout lakes because you might mess up the genetics versus stocking lake trout lakes, just larger populations, so it's less risk?
No, it's the same. So most of the lakes that we stock with the lake trout have minimal or no reproduction. So there isn't what we call a viable population in there anymore. Yeah, so it's being decimated by fishing, habitat change. Some of them just have very limited amount of habitat naturally. So the population was always very small and really couldn't sustain much fishing pressure or stress.
Steve, I'm trying to remember. Am I remembering correctly that the stocked and the natural fish do not interbreed?
Tends to be the case. Yeah, it is. There is a lot of lake to lake variation. It's being worked mostly on Algonquin Park and more on brook trout than lake trout, I think. But in a lot of lakes where brook trout were stocked for years, they found that they didn't leave their genes behind. Basically, they're still native brook trout populations, but there's a full range. There's populations that have been totally being replaced by non-native stocks as well, and really between mixed stocks. So yeah, this slide speaks to the habitat quality comment. So this slide shows the number of lakes that have different levels of hypoliminetic dissolved oxygen in them. So that across the bottom, the mean volume weighted hypoliminetic dissolved oxygen concentration is a measure of the quality of the habitat for lake trout. So the higher the number, the better the habitat for lake trout. And across the vertical axis is the number of lakes in each category, separated by whether they're natural or stocked but rotate lakes. So you can see that the lakes with higher dissolved oxygen tend to be mostly natural lakes, And as you go down, tend to be more foot rotate lakes. There's a lot of variation because, oxygen isn't the only factor that determines the suitability of the lake, but it is one of the main ones. So I mentioned the background information report is, it's a very thick document. I think it's about 300 pages and has many figures that kind of look like this that are derived from the broad scale monitoring program. I just put a couple of them in here as examples. Again, you can look in the background report if you're interested in seeing more. So these show across the bottom of the slide is different fisheries management zones across the province. So you can see that's at zone 15 there towards the right hand side. And on the vertical axis is a measure derived from that broad scale monitoring program. In this case, it's the catch rate of bass from lake trout lakes, which is an indicator of a stress on the lake. The higher the bass population, the more impact there's likely to be on the bass population. So again, this is just an example, but it shows that in most zones across the province, there's a fairly high abundance of bass. Exceptions seem to be in the northwest where it's quite a bit lower. What's not shown on this slide is arguably more important is the proportion or the number of lakes that actually have bass or not. So you can see zone 15, if bass are present, it's pretty similar to other zones, but the southern zones kind of stand out in that almost every lake has bass, whereas in the north, not every lake does. Those would show up here. Another example that shows the abundance of rainbow smelt, which is an introduced species into a lot of lakes. Again, zone 15 probably has the highest proportion of lakes that have smelt in the first place. And those lakes that do have smelt tend to have really high abundance compared to most of the other zones in the province. So again, a stress to consider when we're looking at our goal of preserving lake trout or conserving lake trout across the zone.
How does smelt compete with trout, just for food,
In different ways, they interact at different levels, so they can prey directly on lake trout fry when it's still really small, but lake trout will prey on them as well when the lake trout get bigger. So how they interact can be complicated. It affects their growth rate, the size of them, which they mature, things like that. And the smell can also impact other prey that are in the lakes. So, for example, the Huntsville lakes all had native whitefish and cisco and lake trout populations, which we believe are all wiped out after smelt were introduced. So those lakes don't support any of those species anymore. Oops. And this one shows the catch rate of lake trout themselves in the different zones across the province. So you can see our zone 15 there, about 0.4 kilograms of lake trout per net is about 2/3 or so of what the provincial average is. Quite a bit lower than lakes we're seeing in the northwest of the province, where they tend to be in their most pristine state. So some, just example of indicators that suggest to us that in zone 15 our lake trout are pretty highly stressed and support our objective and our actions of managing them more conservatively than we are right now. One final one, just a local one, just to have the data. There used to be an entity called the Muskoka Lakes Fisheries Assessment Unit. Doesn't exist anymore as a discrete unit. It's kind of being absorbed into the broad scale monitoring program, but they used to do regular, pretty well annual monitoring on Joe Rosso and sometimes Muskoka. This shows the trends in lake trout abundance in Joseph and Rosso over time. So appears to be kind of a long-term downward trend in the catch rate of lake trout in those lakes, though there is a lot of variability there. That's a hand. Oops. So like brook trout, our goal is to conserve natural lake trout. maintain their presence on the landscape or actually increase them if possible, perhaps restoring some of those stock lakes back to naturally reproducing lakes. Maintaining the populations in a high quality state, not managing them for the maximum harvest numbers or things like that. It's more for maintaining the quality of the populations and using those stocking opportunities to provide angling opportunities. Getting my suckers mixed up. So like brook trout, our main management action is to implement a more conservative sport fishing regulation on natural lake trout lakes than we currently have. I say more conservative, depends on which lake we're talking about. Though some lakes already do have some combination of either a shortened season or a size limit, just varies a lot across the zone. But we're proposing a more standardized approach where our small lakes, defined as being less than 500 hectares, would no longer have a winter fishing season. You'd only be able to fish them from the May long weekend till Labor Day with a catch limit of 2, which is what it is now. And the large lakes would have a winter season, but be much shorter than it is now, reduced to Family Day weekend to the end of the March break, essentially. Again, with that catch limit of 2. And then cross purposes to that, depending on the lake, whether the lake had what's called a small bodied or a large bodied population, there'd also be a size limit. So that body size is kind of a generalized term that's based on the growth potential of each population. So lakes that have large prey like smelled Cisco whitefish, the lake trout tend to mature at a larger size and grow to a larger size. And conversely, especially the small lakes that have very limited prey, times only perch or invertebrates, fish don't grow to as big a size. So based on those 2 categories, we're proposing 2 different size limits, either a minimum 40 centimeters or a minimum 50 centimeters. So in some lakes that may or may not be that more conservative than what they're currently managed as. So for example, Scholten Lake currently has a slot size limit, be replaced by that. At the end of the day, it might not be too much different than what we currently have, but there are quite a few lakes, including most of the big lakes, that don't have a size limit and have a full winter season right now. So that'll be a big change for some of the lakes like Lake and Bays, where you can fish them right from January 1st to the end of September with no size limit, to go into a 1-month season, a shorter summer season and a size limit. It's quite a drastic difference. Like the brook trout, we're proposing that use of live bait fish be prohibited on those lake trout lakes that haven't yet been impacted by introduced species. And our current count is that 9 out of our 174 natural and 70 grow take lakes do not have those. So it's a pretty select group of mostly small, fairly remote lakes that have not yet been impacted by these things. And again, similar to brook trout, a stocking strategy for lake trout, that would be not stocking them where viable natural populations are present, reintroducing and rehabilitating them where possible, and stocking fish to divert effort or provide additional opportunities that aren't on natural lakes. Yeah. That pretty well says that. So for our stock lakes, like the brook trout, they would be open year round, which is the case for most now, and no size limit, which is the case now. Just a word for lake whitefish. We don't talk about them too often. They're a lot more of an obscure species for most people, unless you're a winter angler, but they are one of our native cold water species. They do occur in quite a few lakes, but only in a small number of lakes in high enough abundance that most people would recognize that they're actually even there. I didn't put in a map of their distribution, but they're present in at least 100 lakes in the zone. But again, maybe only a handful where there's actually a fishery for them. Lake of Bays is probably the biggest in the zone. Again, are a little bit different of a goal from the brook trout and lake trout is really just to maintain what we have. Just because the fishery for them isn't that big, the stresses are maybe not as high. Maintain those populations and their current abundance. They've been historically managed pretty liberally just because not that many people fish for them. Was it too long ago you could still fish for them year round and keep 25 a day? It was reduced to 12 a day about 10 or so years ago, but we're suggesting it should be even lower than that, put it a little bit more in line with what is actually a reasonable catch considering your status in the zone. Reduce it to 4 a day. I was advocating for actually 2 a day to make it the same as lake trout, but kind of 4 was more preferred by a lot of people. So probably won't actually reduce the harvest that much, but will at least send the message that harvesting 12 whitefish a day is probably not reasonable for a species that is facing a lot of stresses across the zone. And that's I just put in those 3 cold water species. We have similar information for all the other main species, walleye, pike, bass, etc. But these are the ones that were kind of the highlights.